My name is Maria Carter, and I'm 35 years old. This happened just last year, on a chilly October weekend at Eklutna Lake, a place I'd thought would be perfect for a family camping trip. I was wrong. So very wrong. It was supposed to be a reset for us. My husband, John, and I had been drifting apart, and with the stress of my layoff, our two kids, Ellie, 8, and Thomas, 5, had felt the strain too. I suggested we go camping at Eklutna Lake, a beautiful spot I remembered from childhood. I thought it might bring us closer as a family, away from phones, work, and distractions. In hindsight, I should have paid attention to the unease that settled over me the moment we pulled into the campground. The drive to Eklutna was uneventful, though the kids squabbled in the back seat. When we arrived, the lake was exactly as I remembered it, serene, framed by towering mountains dusted with snow. The water sparkled under the weak autumn sun, and the forest surrounding the campground felt ancient and untouched. John parked our RV in a small clearing near the trailhead. He was in a good mood, cracking jokes as he unpacked the gear, but I was already annoyed. The lantern flickered every time we tried to turn it on, and the tent zipper wouldn't close all the way. Minor inconveniences, I told myself, nothing to worry about. Ellie, however, was thrilled. She bounded out of the RV, her dark curls bouncing, and immediately started exploring. "Look, Mama," she called, holding up a smooth white rock. "It's like a magic stone." Thomas, ever the cautious one, clung to my leg. "I don't like it here," he mumbled, but I brushed him off. "It's just new, honey. You'll feel better once we get the fire going." That first night, as John and I sat by the fire, Ellie ran up to us, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "I made a new friend," she announced. "His name is Daniel. He lives here." "Really?" John asked, amused. "Where's Daniel now?" Ellie gestured vaguely toward the trees. "He had to go, but he'll come back tomorrow." I glanced at John, raising an eyebrow. "Imaginary friend," I said quietly, and he nodded. But something about Ellie's tone unsettled me. She wasn't acting like she was pretending. When I asked her to describe Daniel, she said he was about her age, with pale skin and no shoes. "He said he's been waiting for someone to play with," she added. The next day, we decided to explore the area. John took Thomas fishing by the lake while Ellie and I wandered the nearby trails. She kept talking about Daniel, pointing out places where he'd played hide-and-seek or picked berries. At one point, she stopped abruptly. "This is where he's sad," she said, pointing to a patch of mossy ground. "What do you mean?" I asked, kneeling beside her. She shrugged. "He just is." The spot was strange, darker somehow. The trees formed a natural arch overhead, and the air was colder. I noticed the ground was uneven, almost as if something had been buried there. Goosebumps prickled my skin. Later, John found what he thought was an old burial site near the lake. He called me over, his voice tinged with unease. "Looks like graves," he muttered, pointing at the small mounds. I felt a chill, but tried to laugh it off. "Probably just a historic site," I said, though I felt anything but confident. That night, things got worse. We'd just settled into the tent when I heard it. Soft giggling, faint and high-pitched, coming from outside. At first, I thought it was Ellie, but she was sound asleep beside me. John snored quietly on my other side. I lay there, holding my breath as the laughter grew louder. Then, faint footsteps circled the tent. My heart hammered as I reached for John's arm. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. "Hear what?" he mumbled, half asleep. The footsteps stopped. I waited, straining to hear, but there was only silence. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, we found small, muddy footprints around the tent. "Ellie, were you outside last night?" John asked. She shook her head. "It was Daniel," she said matter-of-factly. Ellie's fixation on Daniel grew stronger. By midday, she insisted we play hide-and-seek with him. John and I exchanged wary glances, but agreed. It seemed harmless enough. "Daniel says he wants us to hide near the lake," Ellie said, leading us to the shore. She counted loudly, covering her eyes. John hid behind a boulder. Thomas crouched behind me, and I ducked behind a tree. As Ellie finished counting, I saw something move in the trees. A flash of white, darting between the shadows. My breath caught. It was too tall to be Ellie, too fast to be John. "Found you," Ellie's voice rang out, snapping me out of my thoughts. That evening, Thomas woke up screaming. He clawed at his sleeping bag, his face pale and wet with tears. "They tried to take me," he sobbed. "Who, honey?" I asked, pulling him close. "The bad kids," he whispered. "They were pulling me outside." My stomach turned. John brushed it off as a nightmare, but I saw the look in his eyes. He was scared too. It was then I remembered the stories my grandmother used to tell. She was Dena Ina, and she believed in spirits. She told me about the lost children, spirits of kids who had died near the lake, cursed to wander forever, luring others to join them. I'd laughed at her stories when I was younger. Now I wasn't laughing. Desperate, I searched online and found a vague reference to a Dena Ina ritual. It required an offering to appease the spirits, something meaningful to the person they'd attached themselves to. My eyes landed on Ellie's doll, a handmade toy she'd carried since she was a toddler. John thought I was crazy, but he agreed to help. That night, we stood by the lake, the doll in my trembling hands. Ellie cried, begging me not to give it away. "Daniel says he needs it," she screamed. Ignoring her, I placed the doll on the ground, surrounded by rocks and berries we'd gathered. I recited the only words I could remember from my grandmother's teachings, my voice shaking. The wind howled, and the trees seemed to groan. I felt a presence, several presences closing in. The air grew heavy, and I heard whispers, laughter, and then screams. John grabbed my arm as the ground beneath us seemed to tremble. "Go!" I yelled. "Get the kids to the RV." We bolted, leaving everything behind. As we drove away, Ellie sobbed in the back seat, muttering, "Daniel is so sad." When we finally reached Anchorage, I looked back at the road. For a split second, I thought I saw a pale figure standing by the tree line, holding Ellie's doll. Weeks later, life began to return to normal, or so I thought. One night, as I was tucking Ellie into bed, I saw it. The doll, the one we'd left by the lake, was sitting on her shelf. "Daniel says thank you," Ellie whispered before closing her eyes. My name is Nathan Ryder. I'm 42 years old, and until last year I thought I knew the limits of my fear. I was wrong. What happened to me at Hatcher Pass changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. I went there looking for peace, a chance to reconnect with the world, and maybe even myself. What I found was something far darker. This happened in late October, when the days were shortening and the mountain air had a bite to it. Hatcher Pass, with its jagged peaks and abandoned mining ruins, had always fascinated me. As a retired geologist, the idea of exploring an old site like the Independence Mine had a nostalgic pull. My wife, Claire, and I used to take trips like this, but since her death 2 years ago, I hadn't ventured far from home. That weekend, I decided it was time to change that. I loaded up my old RV with gear and headed for the mountains, hoping the solitude would clear my head. I should have turned back the moment I arrived. The air in Hatcher Pass was heavy with silence, the kind that presses into your ears and settles deep in your chest. I parked my RV near the Independence Mine trailhead, surrounded by a thin veil of fog. The mine itself sat on a ridge, its crumbling structures a stark reminder of a bygone era. A small gravel lot was the only sign of modernity, and I was the sole camper there. It was the solitude I wanted, but as I stepped out of the RV, unease prickled the back of my neck. I told myself it was the fog and the isolation, just my mind playing tricks. The first night was uneventful. I cooked dinner, read a bit, and turned in early. But when I woke up the next morning, the windows of the RV were fogged from the inside. Streaked with what looked like handprints, they weren't mine. I shook off the eerie start and decided to spend the day hiking. The ruins of the Independence Mine were less than a mile up the trail. I packed my day pack with essentials, water, snacks, and my trusty geology hammer, and set off. The fog had thickened overnight, and my headlamp flickered as I ascended the trail, casting strange shadows on the rock walls. The mine was more extensive than I'd imagined. Rusted machinery and broken beams jutted from the earth like the bones of some ancient beast. As I wandered, I noticed carvings on the walls of one of the buildings. They weren't words, but crude, elongated human shapes etched into the stone. They seemed to twist and writhe, as though the figures were alive. I snapped a few photos and moved on, the hairs on my arms bristling. A part of me wanted to turn back, but the geologist in me pressed forward, curious to see what lay deeper in the site. It started as I was heading back to the RV. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move, a shadow darting between the trees. I stopped, spinning to look, but there was nothing there. I chuckled nervously, shaking my head. Just the fog, I muttered, but my heart didn't believe it. The unease stayed with me as I reached the RV. My headlamp flickered again, and I noticed muddy footprints leading away from the vehicle, toward the ridge. They were human-shaped, but elongated. The toes pointed unnaturally forward. I crouched to get a better look, but the prints disappeared into the rocky ground. That night, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, blending with the wind. But as the hours passed, they grew louder, almost forming words. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but they carried a strange cadence, like a chant. I turned on the RV's radio to drown them out, but no station came through, only static. The next day, I decided to stay near the RV. I wasn't sure if I was imagining things or if there really was something out there, but I didn't want to risk wandering too far. As I organized my gear, I noticed that my geology hammer was missing. I was certain I'd brought it back the previous day. When I stepped outside to look for it, I saw them, shadows moving across the ridge above the mine. There were at least 3, maybe 4, their forms barely distinguishable from the fog. They glided rather than walked, their movements unnervingly smooth. I shouted, but they didn't respond. The fog thickened and I lost sight of them. My breath came faster as I backed into the RV, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking. I told myself it was hikers, maybe locals, exploring the area. But deep down, I knew better. That evening, I found an old journal tucked inside one of the ruins I'd explored the day before. The cover was cracked, and the pages smelled of mildew, but the writing was legible. It belonged to a miner who described strange occurrences during the final days of the mine's operation. Shadows that moved without light, whispers in the tunnels, and workers who vanished without a trace. One entry sent a chill down my spine. They come for the lonely ones, the broken ones. They feed on what's left of us, dragging us into the dark to join them. The words felt like they were meant for me. That night, the shadows came closer. I saw them through the RV windows, their forms darker than the fog, their shapes indistinct. They didn't knock or try to enter, but their presence was suffocating. I felt their whispers in my bones, a low hum that resonated with my grief. Then I heard her voice. Claire. Nathan? It was soft, almost loving. I stumbled out of the RV, unable to resist. The fog wrapped around me like a shroud, and the shadows surrounded me. One of them stepped closer, its form shifting until it resembled Claire. Her face was pale and distorted, but her eyes, they were hers. "Stay with me," she whispered. "We can be together again." I wanted to believe it was her, but something felt wrong. The air around me was heavy, cold, and suffocating. My mind screamed at me to run, but my feet refused to move. The shadows began to close in, their whispers merging into a deafening chant. In a desperate act, I reached into my pocket and found a piece of quartz I'd picked up earlier. It was sharp, and I used it to scrape against the wall of the mine, sparking a small rockfall. The noise disrupted the shadows, their forms flickering and retreating. I ran, stumbling down the trail, the fog clinging to me like a second skin. The whispers followed, growing fainter as I neared the RV. I didn't stop driving until I reached Anchorage. I called my neighbor, Evelyn, and told her everything. She didn't believe me, of course, but just hearing her voice grounded me. I decided then that I couldn't keep isolating myself, that my grief had made me vulnerable to whatever those things were. But it wasn't over. A week later, as I unpacked my gear, I found a stone carving in my backpack. It was one of the twisted, human shapes I'd seen in the mine. I knew I hadn't taken it. When I set it on the counter, my shadow on the wall flickered unnaturally. And then I heard it. Claire's voice, faint and distant, whispering my name. My name is Rachel Marlowe, and I'm 36 years old. What happened to me last October on the Dalton Highway still feels like a half-remembered nightmare. But it wasn't a dream. It was real. Too real. I was driving up the Dalton to photograph wildlife and the northern lights. I've been a wildlife photographer for years, traveling solo to the most remote places I can find. It's my way of escaping the noise of the world and, lately, the noise in my head. My younger brother Ian died in an avalanche 3 years ago, and I've never really dealt with it. I thought this trip would give me the clarity I needed, but it only pushed me closer to the edge of something I can't explain. I reached the Adigun Pass on a clear afternoon. The towering mountains were breathtaking, their peaks dusted with snow. The air was sharp and cold, and the isolation was perfect. No cars, no people. Just me and my RV parked off the highway, a speck of life against the endless white wilderness. The plan was simple: set up camp, capture the northern lights, and spend the next few days documenting caribou herds for a gallery project. But as I stepped out of the RV to scout the area, the first thread of unease tugged at me. The snow was untouched, pristine, but there was an odd warmth in the air. It was faint, but noticeable. I chalked it up to the sun and went about my business. That night, as I reviewed my equipment, the wind picked up, howling against the sides of the RV. I was used to the sounds of nature, but this felt different. It carried a strange rhythm, almost like whispers. I brushed it off as my imagination. Grief plays tricks on you, and I'd learned to ignore the little bumps and creaks that came with being alone. But then the CB radio crackled to life. "Anyone out there?" a man's voice called. I grabbed the receiver. "Yes, I'm here." "Who's this?" "Sam Whitman, just a trucker heading south." "You camping out near the pass?" he asked. His voice was calm, friendly, but it carried an edge I couldn't place. "Yeah," I replied, "trying to catch the lights." A pause. Be careful up there. That stretch of road's got stories. Folks see things, hear things. If you notice anything off, don't stick around. I laughed nervously. Like what? Just don't follow the lights, he said. The radio went silent. The snowstorm hit the next morning. Thick, wet flakes blanketed the highway, erasing any trace of the road. I wasn't worried at first. I had enough supplies to last weeks if needed. But as the day dragged on, the storm showed no signs of letting up, and the world outside my RV felt smaller, more suffocating. Around dusk, I saw him. A man walking along the highway. He was tall, wearing a long coat, his face obscured by the falling snow. I hesitated, then grabbed my coat and stepped out. "Hey!" I called, my voice swallowed by the wind. The figure stopped, turned slightly, then disappeared into the storm. No tracks, no sound. Just gone. That night, I heard Ian's voice. "Rachel!" he called, faint and distant, from somewhere outside. I shot up in bed, my heart pounding. I hadn't heard his voice in years, not even in dreams. Grief does strange things, I told myself. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. But then it came again. "Rachel, help me." I stumbled to the window, staring out into the dark. There was nothing but swirling snow, yet the voice came again, clearer this time. "Come find me." My breath caught. I wanted to believe it wasn't real, but it felt so close. The next morning, Sam called on the CB. "You all right up there?" I hesitated. "I heard something last night, someone calling my name." Sam's voice grew tense. "Don't follow it. Whatever you do, don't follow it." "Why?" I asked, my throat dry. "You ever hear of the haunt?" "No." "It's an old story, something out there in the mountains. A devil, they say. It takes on faces, voices, whatever it needs to lure you out. Once it gets you away from safety, you're gone. Forever." I wanted to laugh, to call it ridiculous, but the words clung to me like the cold. The following evening, as the storm began to break, I saw Ian. He was standing at the edge of the tree line, his face pale but unmistakable. He was wearing the same red jacket he'd had on the day he died. My chest tightened. "Ian?" I whispered. He smiled, motioning for me to follow. My instincts screamed to stay put, but grief is a powerful thing. I grabbed my coat and stepped into the snow. The air grew warmer as I approached the trees. The snow underfoot was soft, almost slushy, and the world around me seemed to shift. The trees twisted, their branches clawing at the sky, and Ian's figure flickered like a faulty video. "Rachel," he said, his voice layered with something deeper, darker. "Come closer." I stopped, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. "You're not him," I said, my voice trembling. The figure froze, then tilted its head. Slowly, its form unraveled, revealing something grotesque beneath. Its skin was ash gray, its eyes glowing faintly red, and its mouth twisted into a sharp grin. "You came so far," it whispered, its voice like grinding stone. "Stay with me." The snow around me began to melt, revealing a gaping black chasm at my feet. Heat radiated from the ground, and the creature lunged forward, its clawed hand outstretched. In a panic, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my camera tripod. I swung it wildly, striking the creature's arm. It hissed, recoiling, and I stumbled back, grabbing handfuls of snow to throw at its glowing eyes. The air grew heavier, pressing against my chest, but I forced myself to run. My legs burned as I sprinted toward the RV, the creature's growls echoing behind me. I threw myself into the vehicle, slamming the door and locking it. Outside, the storm raged again, and the figure stood just beyond the window, its red eyes burning through the glass. I didn't sleep that night. At dawn, I started the RV and drove south, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. Sam's voice came over the CB. "You okay?" "Yeah," I lied. "I'm leaving." "Good," he said. "Keep going. And Rachel, don't look back." A week later, as I developed the photos from my trip, I froze. In one of the shots, a wide landscape of the pass, a figure stood in the distance. Tall, shadowy, with faintly glowing eyes. I haven't gone back to the Dalton Highway since, but sometimes on cold nights I swear I hear Ian's voice calling my name. My name is Emma Sloan, and I'm 29 years old. This happened to me last October in the Tongass National Forest, Alaska. I had gone there to escape, to get away from the noise of the city and my deadlines, to breathe in the crisp air of one of the world's most pristine rainforests. But I brought something back with me, something I don't think I'll ever be able to leave behind. It started as a travel blogging trip, another adventure to add to my portfolio. I was there to document the untouched beauty of Alaska, hoping to uncover hidden trails and photograph landscapes most people would never see. The Tongass was perfect for that, with its towering evergreens, endless moss-covered trails, and the promise of a hidden waterfall I'd heard about from a local guide. The guide, David, was polite but hesitant. "The trail's unmarked," he warned, "and it's not a place people usually go." "That's exactly why I want to go," I replied, grinning. He just shook his head, handing me a hand-drawn map. "Stay on the trail, and if you see anything strange, turn back." I wish I had listened. I parked my RV at the edge of the forest, just where David's map indicated. The Tongass was breathtaking. Dense trees stretching endlessly in every direction, their trunks draped in thick moss. The air was damp, carrying the scent of earth and pine. It felt ancient, untouched. I spent the first day scouting the trail, marking landmarks to ensure I wouldn't get lost. The unmarked path was narrow and winding, with roots snaking across the ground and shadows that shifted as the sun filtered through the canopy. There were no signs of other hikers, no litter or footprints. It was exactly the kind of isolation I craved. That evening, as I sat in my RV editing photos, I heard it. A faint scratching at the door. My heart jumped. Tongass was home to bears, wolves, and other wildlife, but I told myself it was probably just a curious raccoon. When I opened the door, there was nothing there. The forest was still, almost too quiet. I shut the door, locked it, and went to bed. The next morning, I set out early, determined to find the waterfall. The trail was harder to follow than I'd expected. Several times I lost my way, only to stumble back onto it by sheer luck. Around midday, I noticed something strange, small symbols carved into the trees. They were intricate, spiraling designs that didn't look natural. I took a few photos, assuming they were the work of some artistic hiker. The deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to change. The air grew heavier and the light dimmed, even though the sun was still high. Whispers began to tickle the edges of my hearing, faint and distant, as if the trees themselves were murmuring. I brushed it off as the wind and kept moving. But then I found the effigy. It was hanging from a low branch, made of small bones tied together with what looked like dried sinew. It spun slowly in the breeze, and for the first time I felt a pang of unease. The whispers grew louder as I stared at it, almost forming words. I took a photo and hurried past, pretending it didn't bother me. That evening, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As I sat in the RV, reviewing my photos, David's words echoed in my mind. "If you see anything strange, turn back." I laughed nervously, telling myself I was just spooking myself. But the laughter died when I zoomed in on the photo of the effigy. There was something in the background. A shadowy figure standing among the trees. It was indistinct, almost blending into the forest, but its shape was unmistakable. A woman, tall and gnarled, with arms that seemed too long and twisted. I closed my laptop, my skin crawling. That night, the scratching at the RV returned, louder this time, and then I heard it. A low, guttural laugh just outside the door. My heart raced as I grabbed a flashlight and swung it toward the window. The beam illuminated only darkness and trees. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I told myself I was imagining things. Sleep deprivation and isolation could play tricks on anyone's mind. I set out again, determined to find the waterfall and put my unease behind me. But the trail had changed. The symbols on the trees were more frequent now, more intricate, as if they were guiding me or warning me. The whispers returned, louder than before, and the air grew colder despite the midday sun. I finally reached the waterfall in the late afternoon. It should have been beautiful, but something about it felt wrong. The water was dark and sluggish, and the clearing around it was littered with more effigies. At the center of the clearing was a crude altar made of stones, covered in moss and what looked like dried blood. As I raised my camera to take a photo, the whispers stopped. The silence was absolute, pressing in on me like a physical weight, and then I felt it. A presence behind me. I turned slowly, and there she was. The figure from the photo stood at the edge of the clearing, her body impossibly thin and twisted, her eyes hollow and glowing faintly. Her hair hung in matted strands, and her hands were clawed, blackened with soot. She didn't move, but the air around her seemed to ripple, distorting the forest like a heat wave. "Who are you?" I managed to whisper, my voice trembling. She didn't answer. Instead, she raised a hand, pointing directly at me. The ground beneath me seemed to shift, and I stumbled, falling to my knees. The mark on my forearm burned, and I realized it had spread, branching like roots across my skin. I scrambled back, gasping, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." My voice broke as the witch stepped closer, her movements unnatural, jerking, as if she were a puppet on invisible strings. The whispers returned, deafening now, merging into a guttural chant. I felt my vision blur, the world spinning as the air grew heavier. I couldn't breathe. In a moment of desperate clarity, I remembered David's warning. If she marks you, the only way out is to leave an offering. I fumbled with my backpack, pulling out my camera and notebook. My hands shook as I placed them on the ground before the altar. "Take it," I whispered. "Please, just let me go." The witch paused, tilting her head. The whispers faded, replaced by an eerie silence. She stepped closer, her clawed hand hovering over the camera. Then, with a guttural hiss, she snatched it and vanished. The forest fell deathly silent. I stumbled back to the RV, my body trembling. When I reached it, the scratches on the door were deeper, as if something had been clawing at it all night. I didn't look back as I started the engine and drove away. When I reached the nearest town, I called David. He listened silently as I recounted everything, then said only, "You're lucky. Most don't make it out." The mark on my arm faded over the next few days, but the memory didn't. I wrote about the experience on my blog, leaving out the darker details. Most readers thought it was fiction, a ghost story for Halloween, but I know the truth. Months later, I received a package in the mail. Inside was my missing camera. I hesitated, then turned it on. The last photo in the gallery was of me, standing in the clearing, with the witch's shadow looming over me. My name is Aaron Scott, and I'm 28 years old. This happened in late September, during a weekend trip to Bird Creek Trail in Alaska's Chugach State Park. I wasn't supposed to go. I had work piling up, a mountain of grading to do, and a headache I couldn't shake. But when Jack called and mentioned he'd found a secluded cabin deep in the woods, a part of me couldn't resist. Jack Martinez, my ex. Charismatic, infuriating, and utterly impossible to ignore. He was the kind of guy who could sell you on the most reckless idea and make you believe it was the adventure of a lifetime. And then there were Lisa Chang and Tyler Briggs, two of my closest friends from college. We hadn't all been together in years, and I thought, why not? Maybe this trip would help mend some fences, or at least remind me why I loved the outdoors in the first place. We set out early that Friday morning, crammed into Tyler's old Subaru with gear piled to the roof. Jack had insisted we pack light, promising the cabin was equipped with everything we'd need. Authentic Alaskan vibes, he'd said, grinning. In hindsight, I should have known better. Bird Creek Trail was beautiful, the kind of place that made you forget how remote and unforgiving Alaska could be. The air was crisp, the leaves just starting to turn golden. Jack couldn't stop taking pictures, leaning out the car window like a kid on his first road trip. Tyler, ever the joker, kept teasing Lisa about her reluctance to come. "Still think you're a city girl at heart?" he asked. Lisa rolled her eyes. "I can handle it. Besides, I didn't want to miss watching you fall on your face trying to set up a tent." The trailhead was quiet when we arrived, save for a lone ranger locking up his truck. He gave us a once-over, his gaze lingering on Jack's oversized camera bag. "You folks headed far in?" he asked. "Not too far." Jack lied effortlessly. The ranger nodded but didn't look convinced. "Be careful, weather can turn quick out here, and we've had reports of strange activity. Probably nothing, but still." "What kind of strange activity?" Lisa asked, her voice a little too eager. The ranger hesitated. "Just things moving through the trees. Sounds at night. Could be wolves or bears, but it's better to stick together. Don't wander off." The hike to the cabin was grueling. Tyler's tent had a tear in it, letting in the wind, and Jack had insisted on taking a shortcut that added an extra hour to the trek. By the time we reached the clearing, my legs felt like jelly. The cabin was exactly as Jack described, old, weathered, and full of character. The windows were cracked, the door hanging slightly off its hinges, but it had a rustic charm. We unpacked quickly, setting up a fire pit outside while Jack explored the interior. "Guess what I found," he called, emerging with a grin. In his hands was a bundle of old hunting gear, traps, rusted knives, and a fraying leather pouch. "Leave it," I said instinctively. "Relax," Jack replied. "It's probably been here for decades. Besides, it's kind of cool, don't you think?" Lisa didn't look convinced, but she didn't argue. Tyler, meanwhile, was already poking around the tree line, muttering something about animal tracks. The first night, the sounds started. At first, it was faint, a rustling in the bushes, a low growl that could have been the wind, but as the night wore on, it became unmistakable. "Do you hear that?" Lisa whispered, clutching her sleeping bag. I nodded, straining to listen. It was a voice, soft and distant, calling out from the woods, my name. "Aaron," it said, almost sing-song. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Jack stirred beside me, half asleep. "Did you hear that?" I hissed. "Hear what?" "Someone's out there. They're calling my name." Jack sat up, frowning. "It's probably just the wind. Go back to sleep." But I couldn't. Not with that voice repeating over and over. Just loud enough to hear, but too faint to pinpoint. The next morning, I found footprints around the cabin, barefoot, human-sized, but oddly elongated. Tyler claimed they were just a trick of the dirt, but his hands trembled as he spoke. Lisa's phone died suddenly, despite being fully charged the night before. "That's weird," she muttered, shaking it. "It was working fine." Jack's camera wasn't any better. When he tried to review his photos, half of them were distorted. Shadowy figures bleeding into the edges, faces that weren't there when he took the shots. "You're messing with us," Lisa said, her voice wavering. "I'm not," Jack insisted. "I swear, this is what the camera picked up." By the second night, the tension was palpable. We stayed close to the fire, barely speaking. The sounds were louder now. Footsteps circling the cabin, branches snapping, low growls that made the hairs on my neck stand up. Then we saw it. At the edge of the clearing stood a figure, tall and gaunt, its face hidden in shadow. For a moment I thought it was a person, but then it moved, jerky, unnatural, its limbs bending in ways no human could. "Is that a deer?" Lisa whispered. "No," Tyler said, his voice shaking. "It's not." The figure stepped closer, and I realized it was wearing a tattered coat, but its face wasn't human. Lisa panicked, bolting toward the woods despite our shouts. The creature moved faster than I thought possible, disappearing into the trees after her. "Lisa!" Jack yelled, grabbing his flashlight. We ran after her, the beam bouncing wildly as we stumbled through the underbrush. When we found her, she was lying on the ground, her arms slashed open and her face pale. "It's real," she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "It's real." Tyler, who had always been superstitious, insisted on carving protective symbols into the trees around the cabin. "It's the only way," he said, his voice grim. "My grandma told me stories about these things. They're skinwalkers. They can mimic voices, change shape. They'll hunt us until we're dead unless we fight back." Jack dismissed him, calling it nonsense, but I wasn't so sure anymore. When we found an old talisman buried near the cabin, a bundle of feathers and bones tied with string, I felt a chill run down my spine. "Burn it," Tyler said. "What? No," Jack argued. "It's part of the history here. We can't just destroy it." "It's the only way to weaken them." That night, the creatures attacked in full force. They circled the cabin, their shapes flickering between human and animal. The firelight cast grotesque shadows as they clawed at the windows and howled like wolves. Tyler lit the talisman on fire, the smoke filling the air with a sharp, acrid smell. The creatures recoiled, their screams echoing through the forest. But one of them lunged forward, dragging Tyler into the darkness before we could stop it. "Tyler!" I screamed. But he was gone. At dawn, the forest was silent. Lisa was barely conscious, her wounds wrapped hastily in Jack's shirt. We stumbled back to the trailhead, leaving everything behind. When we reached the ranger station, I told them everything. They nodded gravely, but I could tell they didn't believe us. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw Tyler standing at the edge of the woods, his face pale and hollow. But when I turned, there was nothing there. I haven't been back to Bird Creek since. Some nights, though, I still hear my name being called, soft and distant, like an echo through the trees. My name is Caleb Rhodes, and I'm 35 years old. This happened in late October when I was camping alone in Denali National Park, Alaska. I was there for work, a travel article on the solitude and serenity of off-grid camping. It was supposed to be simple, a week in a rented RV exploring the remote wilderness, writing about the peace and beauty of nature. Instead, I found something I'll never be able to forget, no matter how hard I try. I parked the RV at a secluded pull-off near the edge of the forest. The trees rose like black spires against the twilight sky, their skeletal branches swaying in the wind. It was quiet, so quiet that I could hear my own breath and the faint hum of the RV's engine as it cooled. The first evening passed without much incident. I set up a small campfire, took a few photos of the surrounding landscape, and jotted notes about the stillness of the park. It wasn't until I wandered deeper into the woods the next day that things began to feel wrong. I found the cabin about a half-mile from my campsite. It was old, maybe from the 1930s or 40s, with a slanted roof and rotting wooden walls. Carvings marked the doorframe, strange symbols I didn't recognize but couldn't stop staring at. I told myself it was just graffiti left by some bored hikers, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I turned the rusted doorknob. Inside, the air was colder than it had any right to be. The room was bare except for a broken chair, a rusted stove, and a pile of rags that might have once been bedding. On the floor, partially buried beneath years of dirt, I found a leather-bound journal. The cover was cracked, the pages yellowed, but the writing was still legible. The journal belonged to a fur trapper named Thomas Whitlock. The first few entries were mundane, describing the harsh winter and dwindling food supplies. But as I read further, the tone shifted. Whitlock wrote of watchers in the woods, figures he claimed followed him and his companions, appearing as shadows just beyond the firelight. The final entry was scrawled so hastily that the ink bled across the page. They watch from the trees. Never alone, never safe. If you find this, leave while you still can. I should have left the journal there, but something about it intrigued me. Maybe it was the writer in me, hungry for a good story, or maybe it was just plain stupidity. Either way, I tucked the journal into my bag and headed back to the RV. That night, I woke to a strange noise. At first, I thought it was the wind, long, low howls that rattled the RV's thin walls, but then I heard something else. Faint whispers, like a child murmuring just outside the door. My name. Caleb, the voice whispered, soft and sweet. I bolted upright, my heart hammering in my chest. The fire outside had died hours ago, and the night was pitch black. Grabbing my flashlight, I peered out the window, expecting to see nothing. Instead, I saw footprints, barefoot, human-sized, and leading straight to the RV door. The next day, I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was some prankster messing with me. But deep down, I knew better. I'd parked miles away from the nearest trailhead. Nobody should have been out here. As I brewed coffee, I noticed something strange. My flashlight, which I'd left on the counter, was now on the passenger seat of the RV. My journal had been moved too, the pages open to one of Whitlock's entries about the Watchers. I hadn't touched it since last night. Calm down, I muttered to myself. It's nothing. But it didn't feel like nothing. That afternoon, I hiked back to the cabin, hoping to find some logical explanation for what was happening. As I approached, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The carvings on the door seemed sharper now, as if freshly made. Inside, the cold was worse, biting into my skin despite the layers I wore. I snapped a few photos with my phone, but when I looked at them later, they were distorted. Dark smudges obscured the cabin's interior, and in one, I swore I saw a shadowy figure standing near the stove. That night, the whispers returned. This time, they were louder, more insistent. My name echoed through the trees, followed by faint knocking on the RV door. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I found a child's doll sitting on the RV's dashboard. Its porcelain face was cracked, its dress singed at the edges, as if it had been in a fire. I hadn't brought any toys with me. The sight of it made my stomach churn. I thought about leaving right then and there, but When I tried to start the RV, the engine sputtered and died. I checked the battery, the fuel lines. Everything seemed fine. It didn't make sense. Desperate, I grabbed the journal and started flipping through its pages, hoping for some kind of answer. That's when I found a passage about a ritual the trappers had performed to protect themselves. It involved burning an object tied to the spirits and scattering salt around the cabin. As night fell, I prepared for the ritual. I poured salt in a circle around the RV and tossed the doll into the fire. The whispers grew louder as the flames consumed it, rising to a deafening pitch. Then came the shadows. They emerged from the woods, dozens of them, their forms shifting and flickering like smoke. Their eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the firelight. They didn't speak, but I could feel their anger, their hatred. One of them stepped closer, its face half hidden but unmistakably human. "Leave," it hissed, the word more a growl than a voice. I wanted to run, but I knew I wouldn't make it far. Instead, I clutched the journal like a lifeline and stayed inside the salt circle, praying it would hold. At dawn, the shadows vanished, retreating into the woods as if they'd never been there. The RV started without issue, the engine roaring to life as though nothing had happened. I didn't question it. I drove out of there as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached the nearest ranger station. When I showed the rangers the journal and told them what had happened, they exchanged uneasy glances. One of them admitted he'd heard similar stories from other campers over the years. "Some places in Denali," he said, "just aren't meant for people." I left Alaska the next day, but the memories have never left me. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers, soft, sweet, calling my name. My name is Emily Harper, and I'm 29 years old. This happened last summer when I decided to take a solo RV trip to Chena Hot Springs, deep in the Alaskan wilderness. I went there to escape the noise of the city, clear my head, and maybe, just maybe, find the inspiration I needed to finish my novel. Instead, I found something I still can't explain, something that's been haunting me every day since. The trip began like most of my solo adventures. I packed my RV with the essentials, food, water, notebooks, and my laptop, and drove for hours until I reached the remote campsite near the hot springs. The spot was perfect. Nestled in the woods, far from other campers, with a view of the Chena River winding its way through the trees. The air was crisp, the forest alive with birdsong, and for the first time in months I felt a sense of calm. I spent my first day exploring the area, taking notes for a story idea that had been percolating in the back of my mind. It was supposed to be a ghost story, set in a small haunted town. I had no idea how fitting that would turn out to be. The first sign that something wasn't right came that evening. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I heard faint laughter outside the RV. It sounded like children playing, a distant, high-pitched giggle carried on the breeze. I brushed it off as my imagination, maybe the result of spending too much time alone in the woods. But later that night, as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard it again. This time, it was closer, right outside the RV door. I sat up, my heart racing and strained to listen. The laughter stopped, replaced by the faint sound of knocking. 3 soft taps, like a small hand against the metal. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously opened the door, but there was no one there. Just the quiet rustling of the trees and the cool night air. Shaking my head, I muttered to myself, "Get it together, Emily. It's just your imagination." The next morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. A tiny mitten on the RV's dashboard. It wasn't mine, and I hadn't seen anyone nearby. The sight of it filled me with unease, but I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe another camper had left it behind. Maybe I'd picked it up without realizing. I didn't want to think about the other possibility. I spent the day hiking, trying to shake the uneasy feeling. The woods were beautiful, but they felt off. The bird song I'd heard when I arrived was gone, replaced by an eerie silence. Even the squirrels and rabbits seemed to avoid me, their absence making the forest feel emptier than it should have. By the time I returned to the RV, the sun was setting, and a thick fog was rolling in from the river. I was exhausted, but my nerves were still on edge. That night, as I tried to write, I felt like I was being watched. Every time I glanced at the windows, I expected to see someone or something staring back at me. The third night was when things truly escalated. I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside the RV, small and deliberate, like a child walking barefoot on the gravel. My breath caught in my throat as I listened, frozen in place. The footsteps circled the RV, stopping at each window. Then came the knocking again. Soft, insistent, and moving from one window to the next. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. "Is someone there?" The only response was a faint giggle, followed by a whisper that sent chills down my spine. "Come play with us." I bolted out of bed, grabbed my flashlight, and threw open the door. The beam of light cut through the fog, revealing nothing. No footprints, no children, no sign that anyone had been there. But when I turned back to the RV, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Tiny, muddy handprints smeared across the windows. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough. I packed up my things and tried to leave, but the RV wouldn't start. I checked the battery, the fuel line, the ignition. Everything was fine, but the engine wouldn't turn over. It was as if the RV was refusing to let me leave. Desperate, I decided to hike back to the main trail to look for help. But the woods seemed to conspire against me. No matter which path I took, I kept ending up back at the campsite. It was as if the forest was shifting around me, trapping me in some kind of loop. That evening, as I sat in the RV trying to figure out what to do, I heard a voice. A soft, trembling voice that didn't sound like the others. "Are you lost?" I spun around and saw her. A little girl standing just outside the RV door. She looked about 7 years old, with pale skin, dark hair, and a tattered dress that looked like it belonged to another century. She wasn't like the others. She seemed sad, almost apologetic. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice shaking. "My name is Clara," she said. "You shouldn't be here." "Why not?" "They won't let you leave," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "They want you to stay." Over the next few hours, Clara told me her story. She had been part of a group of children who got lost in the woods during a school outing in the early 1900s. A sudden snowstorm had stranded them, and they'd all frozen to death before help could arrive. Their spirits were now bound to the forest, unable to move on. Clara seemed kind, but she warned me about the others. Spirits who had grown bitter and angry over the years, their loneliness twisting into something dangerous. "They're jealous," she said. "They don't want you to leave because we can't." As if on cue, I heard the sound of footsteps again, heavier this time. The shadows outside the RV seemed to deepen, and the air grew colder. Clara's face filled with fear. "They're coming," she said. "You have to make them let you go." The final night was a blur of terror. The shadows closed in around the RV, their forms taking shape in the fog. I saw their faces pressed against the windows, distorted, ghostly images of children, their eyes hollow and their mouths twisted into grimaces of rage. The RV shook as if something, or someone, was trying to break in. The voices grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony of screams, laughter, and whispers. Stay with us. Play with us. Don't leave. Clara appeared again, her face pale and drawn. You have to make them remember, she said. Tell them who they were. In a desperate act, I grabbed my notebook and started shouting the names she'd told me. Thomas, Abigail, Peter, Clara. I called each name, repeating the details of their lives, their stories, their families. The shadows hesitated, their forms flickering as if caught between two worlds. You're not alone, I said, tears streaming down my face. You were loved. You still are. As dawn broke, the shadows began to dissolve, their voices fading into the morning light. Clara smiled at me one last time before disappearing into the mist. The RV's engine roared to life as if nothing had ever been wrong. I drove away, shaken but alive, carrying the memory of those children with me. Back home, I began writing their story, hoping to give them the recognition they deserved. But even now, as I sit at my desk, I can still hear faint laughter behind me, as if they're watching, waiting, and wondering if I'll ever return. My name is Logan Reed, and I'm 32 years old. What I'm about to share is something I've never spoken about publicly. Not on my YouTube channel, not to my friends, not to anyone. This happened last summer during what was supposed to be my greatest solo adventure. 10 days alone in the wilderness of the Kenai Peninsula in Alaska. I went in confident, prepared, and certain that I could handle anything nature threw at me. I was wrong. I'd driven my RV deep into the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge, following a narrow, rutted dirt road until it ended near Skilak Lake. The spot was perfect, miles away from any other humans, with breathtaking views of the water and the mountains beyond. This was my element. My channel, Logan's Survival, was all about pushing limits and testing my skills, and this trip was going to be my crown jewel. No backup, no contact with the outside world, just me and the wild. The first few days went as planned. I set up camp, recorded some footage for my channel, and explored the area. The lake was pristine, the forest alive with the sounds of birds and the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. I felt at peace. But then things started to change. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly. The wildlife around my camp seemed to disappear. The cheerful chirping of birds that had greeted me every morning fell silent, and I noticed that even squirrels and rabbits were avoiding the area. At first, I dismissed it as a coincidence. Animals move around. It's what they do. But then I found the bones. I'd gone into the woods to gather firewood when I stumbled upon them. At first, I thought they were just random animal remains, maybe the leftovers of a predator's kill, but as I looked closer, I saw that the bones had been arranged in a pattern, like a crude symbol. I took a step back, my instincts telling me to leave it alone, but curiosity got the better of me. I snapped a photo with my phone, planning to analyze it later. That night, as I reviewed my footage in the RV, I noticed something strange. In one of the videos I'd recorded near the lake, there was a shadowy figure in the background. Tall, human-like, but somehow off. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted unnaturally. I hadn't seen anyone while filming and the figure didn't move. I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the light, but deep down I knew that wasn't true. The next night, I woke up to a faint scratching sound on the side of the RV. It was so soft that at first I thought I'd imagined it, but then it came again, deliberate and rhythmic. My heart pounded as I grabbed my flashlight and swung open the door. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing. The scratching stopped the moment I stepped outside, and the forest around me was deathly silent. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I found more of those strange bones near the RV, this time in a circle. It felt like a warning, but I wasn't ready to give up. I'd spent too much time hyping up this trip to my followers, and I wasn't about to let my imagination get the better of me. But the forest had other plans. Things escalated quickly after that. My supplies started to vanish. It began with small things, a granola bar, a lighter. But then entire bags of food disappeared. I couldn't figure out how. The RV was locked, and there were no signs of animals breaking in. I checked the locks and windows over and over, but everything was secure. It was like the forest itself was taking my supplies. The whispers came next. At first, I thought it was just the wind. But then I heard it clearly. My name. Logan. A voice, soft and familiar, drifting through the trees. It sounded like Rachel, my ex-girlfriend, who used to come on these trips with me before we broke up. I knew it couldn't be her, she was thousands of miles away. But the voice was so convincing that I almost called out in response. The forest was playing tricks on me, and it was winning. By the 6th day, I was barely holding it together. My sleep was plagued by nightmares of shadowy figures surrounding the RV, tapping on the windows, whispering to me in voices I knew and didn't know. When I woke, I found muddy handprints on the windows, too large to be human but unmistakably shaped like hands. Then there were the hallucinations, or at least I thought they were hallucinations. One evening, as I was gathering water from the lake, I saw Rachel standing on the opposite shore. She was barefoot, her hair tangled, and she was smiling at me. But her eyes were wrong. Black, empty pits that seemed to swallow the light. She raised her hand and beckoned me, her lips moving silently. I stumbled back to the RV, my pulse racing. Whatever was out there, it wasn't Rachel. That night, I found the journal. It was in a rusted metal box near the edge of the forest, half buried in the dirt. The leather cover was cracked with age, and the pages were yellowed and brittle. It belonged to someone named David, a trapper who had lived in the area over a century ago. His entries described strange encounters with what he called the hungry shadows. According to David, these entities were tied to an ancient curse, a group of settlers who had resorted to cannibalism during a harsh winter. Their spirits, consumed by insatiable hunger, now roamed the land, preying on the isolated and the desperate. David's final entry was scrawled in shaky handwriting. They're inside. I can't fight them anymore. If you find this, leave while you still can. I didn't need any more warnings. I packed what was left of my supplies and tried to start the RV, but the engine wouldn't turn over. I checked everything, the battery, the fuel line, the ignition, but it was as if the vehicle had simply died. The shadows weren't going to let me leave. That night was the worst. The whispers became screams, voices battering the walls of the RV, telling me to open the door, to join them, to give in. The shadowy figures were everywhere, pressing against the windows, their faces distorted and inhuman. One of them looked like Rachel. Another looked like me. I curled up in the corner, clutching a hunting knife as if it could protect me. But I knew the truth. There was no fighting them. They weren't physical, they were in my head, feeding on my fear, my loneliness, my guilt. At dawn, the shadows retreated, leaving me shaken but alive. I stumbled out of the RV, half mad with exhaustion, and started walking. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away. After hours of wandering, I found a dirt road and followed it until I collapsed. A search team found me 2 days later, dehydrated and delirious. I told them I'd gotten lost, that the RV had broken down, that I'd panicked. I didn't tell them about the shadows. Who would believe me? Now, months later, I sit in front of my computer, editing the footage from that trip. The videos are mostly unusable, static, blurry images, and distorted audio. But there's one clip that stops me cold. It's from the last night inside the RV. The camera was running, though I don't remember turning it on. In the footage, I'm sitting in the corner, clutching the knife. The whispers are loud, almost deafening, and the shadows are everywhere. But there's one moment that chills me to my core. One of the shadows steps forward, and its face comes into view. It's me. I don't know if I survived that trip or if the hungry shadows took me and left something else in my place. But one thing is certain, I'll never go back to the Kenai Peninsula. Some places aren't meant to be explored. My name is Daniel Lark, but everyone calls me Danny. I'm 29 years old, and I used to be a professional snowboarder. After an accident wrecked my career, I turned to travel blogging, chasing adrenaline in new ways. That's how I ended up in Alaska, parked at the base of the Hatcher Pass in my rented RV. I was there to explore the abandoned Miners' Lodge, a forgotten relic buried deep in the mountains. It was supposed to be the centerpiece of my next blog post. Instead, it nearly killed me. The drive to Hatcher Pass was brutal. Snow blanketed the winding roads, and the sky threatened another storm. I'd heard about the lodge from an old man in Anchorage who swore it was haunted. Not the friendly kind of haunted, he'd said with a laugh, but you go on ahead, kid. I parked the RV just before the trailhead and strapped on my gear. The hike to the lodge was only supposed to take an hour, but the snow made every step a struggle. By the time I reached the clearing, the sky had darkened and my breath puffed in quick clouds. The lodge loomed ahead, half hidden by frost-covered pines. It was a hulking structure of weathered wood and sagging beams, with broken windows that gaped like empty eye sockets. A chill swept over me as I stepped inside. The lodge was worse than I'd expected. Half-collapsed furniture, icy drafts, and walls marked with deep scratches that looked like claw marks. The air smelled faintly of decay, and the silence pressed in around me. I was used to being alone in remote places, but something about this silence felt alive. As I set up camp in the lodge's main room, I found a crumpled piece of paper on the floor. The handwriting was jagged, desperate. It's not the cold that'll kill you, it's the hunger. I laughed it off, telling myself it was just a joke left by some thrill seeker. But the thought lingered as I unpacked my gear and made a small fire in the old, soot-stained fireplace. That night, the storm rolled in, howling against the lodge like a living thing. I woke to the sound of scratching. It was faint at first, like tree branches scraping against the walls, but it grew louder and more deliberate. My flashlight cast long shadows on the warped wood, but nothing moved. Then I heard footsteps. Not outside, but inside the lodge. Slow, deliberate, crunching on the icy floorboards. I held my breath, clutching the handle of my hunting knife, but the sounds faded away. When I finally worked up the courage to check the other rooms, they were empty. Still, I locked the door to my room and kept the knife by my side for the rest of the night. The next morning, the trail back to the RV was buried under fresh snow. I tried to push through, but after hours of slogging through waist-deep drifts, I realized I was going in circles. The storm had erased any sign of the path, and the forest seemed to close in tighter with every step. I returned to the lodge, exhausted and starving. That's when I noticed my food supplies were gone. My bag, which I'd left zipped up in the corner, was now open, its contents scattered. Most of it was missing entirely. Granola bars, jerky, even my canteen. I hadn't heard a single sound during the night, yet something had taken it. The hunger set in fast. I rationed what little I had left, but it wasn't enough. By the end of the second day, my stomach ached and I felt weak and lightheaded. The storm showed no signs of letting up. On the third day, I explored the rest of the lodge, hoping to find something I'd missed. Food, a forgotten stash, anything. That's when I found the journal hidden in a drawer in the kitchen. The pages were brittle and yellowed, the handwriting spidery and uneven. The journal belonged to a miner named Edward Grant, one of the men who'd lived here decades ago. The entries started innocently enough, describing the harsh winter and dwindling supplies. But as I read on, the tone shifted. Edward wrote about a hunger that crept into their minds, driving them mad. He described seeing a creature, a gaunt, deer-like figure with glowing eyes, that whispered to them, urging them to feed. The final entry was almost illegible. It's inside now. It won't stop until we're all gone. That night, I saw it for the first time. I was sitting by the fire trying to ignore the gnawing pain in my stomach when a shadow flickered in the corner of my eye. I turned, and there it was. Tall, emaciated, its skin stretched tight over its bones. Its head resembled a deer's skull, but its eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the dark. It didn't move, but I could feel its presence, cold and oppressive. My breath caught in my throat as it tilted its head, almost curious. Then it spoke, its voice a guttural rasp. "You're hungry, aren't you?" I scrambled backward, my heart pounding. The creature didn't follow. It simply watched, its gaze heavy with something I couldn't name. When I blinked, it was gone. The next few days blurred together in a haze of hunger and fear. My food was gone, and the lodge seemed to close in tighter with each passing hour. I started to hallucinate, visions of food, laughter, and warmth that vanished as soon as I reached out for them. One morning, I woke to find bite marks on my hands and arms. At first, I thought the creature had attacked me in my sleep, but then I saw the blood on my lips. I'd done it to myself. I knew I couldn't stay in the lodge any longer. If I did, I'd die, or worse, become something like the creature I'd seen. I packed my remaining gear and made my way to the basement, where the miners had stored their tools. Among the rusted equipment, I found an old mining pick, its blade dull but sturdy. That night, the creature returned. It stood just beyond the firelight, its eyes burning with hunger. "You can't leave," it said, its voice like ice cracking. "The storm will take you, the hunger will take you." I lunged at it with the pick, swinging wildly. It moved faster than I expected, dodging with inhuman grace, but I managed to land a blow on its side. The creature howled, its form flickering like a shadow in the wind. I ran to the fireplace, grabbing a half-empty can of kerosene from the mantel. As the creature lunged toward me, I doused the fire and the surrounding floor in kerosene and struck a match. The flames roared to life, engulfing the creature in a torrent of heat and light. Its screams echoed through the lodge, a sound I'll never forget. At dawn, the storm finally broke. The trail to the RV was still buried, but the sky had cleared enough for me to find my bearings. I stumbled back to the RV, my body weak and trembling, and found claw marks on the vehicle's hood, as if the creature had tried to follow me. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. When I looked in the mirror later, my face was gaunt, my eyes sunken. I'd lost more weight than seemed possible in just a few days. I tried to write about what happened, but every time I put pen to paper, the words felt wrong, like they didn't belong to me. I reviewed my photos from the trip, hoping for some proof, but all I found were shadowy glimpses of the creature in the corners of the lodge, its glowing eyes fixed on me. I've stopped blogging since then. Some nights, I dream of Hatcher Pass and the creature's voice whispering in the dark. "You're hungry, aren't you?" My name is Jake Turner, and I was 40 when this happened. I used to be a park ranger before I left it all behind. After a wildfire ravaged the park I was supposed to protect, I walked away from everything: my job, my home, my friends. The fire destroyed more than land, it destroyed me. I've spent the last few years living out of my RV, chasing solitude. That's how I ended up in the Valley of 10,000 Smokes in Katmai National Park, Alaska. I'd read about its haunting, volcanic beauty, a place where ash covers the earth and fumaroles whisper steam into the air. It sounded like the kind of isolation I craved. But the valley wasn't what I expected. It wasn't peaceful. It was alive. And it wanted me gone. I arrived early in the morning and parked my RV at a remote spot along the valley's edge. The landscape stretched out in all directions, barren and gray, the remains of an ancient volcanic eruption. Steam hissed from cracks in the ground, and the air smelled faintly of sulfur. This was perfect. No tourists, no noise, just the desolation I'd come to embrace. I spent the first day hiking, taking in the surreal beauty of the place. The ash crunched beneath my boot, and the wind carried a strange, dry heat despite the cool autumn air. As the sun began to set, I noticed something odd: scorch marks on the ground. They weren't random. They looked like claw marks, burned into the ash in neat, parallel lines. I knelt down to get a better look. The edges of the marks were still warm, as if whatever had made them had just passed through. Probably just a hot vent, I muttered to myself, though my voice sounded unconvincing even to my own ears. I headed back to my RV as the light faded, determined not to let my imagination get the better of me. That night, I woke to a sound. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling the RV, but then I heard it again. Faint crackling, like the sound of a distant fire. I sat up, my heart pounding. Fire had a way of embedding itself in my mind, haunting me even years later. I grabbed my flashlight and peered out the window. Nothing. But the smell of smoke lingered, faint but unmistakable. I stepped outside, the cold air biting against my skin. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the ash-covered ground. There were no flames, no glowing embers, only silence. As I turned to head back inside, something caught my eye. A shadow flickering at the edge of the light. It wasn't from me or the RV. It moved on its own, twisting unnaturally. I froze, my breath clouding in the cold air. The shadow didn't approach, but it lingered just beyond the reach of the flashlight, as if watching me. When I blinked, it was gone. The next day, I told myself it was a trick of the light, a combination of exhaustion and nerves. But the valley didn't let me forget. As I hiked deeper into the ash-covered landscape, the air grew warmer, almost stifling. The scent of smoke was stronger now, and every so often, I heard that crackling sound again, closer this time. That's when I stumbled across the campsite. It was abandoned, the tents half-burned and sagging under a layer of ash. A rusted fire pit sat in the center, surrounded by charred bones. Human bones. I backed away, my stomach twisting. The air felt heavier here, suffocating. My instinct was to run, but something kept me rooted in place. As I turned to leave, I noticed a fire axe lodged in the ground nearby. Its handle was blackened, the metal head covered in rust. I pulled it free without thinking, its weight oddly comforting in my hands. I made my way back to the RV, my nerves raw. That night, the shadow returned. I was sitting at the small table inside the RV, trying to write in my journal. The words wouldn't come. My mind kept drifting back to the campsite, the charred bones, the oppressive heat. Then the crackling started again, louder this time, like a fire roaring just outside. I stood, gripping the fire axe, My flashlight swept across the windows, but all I saw was darkness. Still, the sound grew, filling the small space. And then I saw it. A flicker of light, faint and orange, dancing just outside the window. I rushed to the door, throwing it open. The shadow was there, its edges glowing with an unnatural fire. It moved toward me, its form shifting like smoke. "You left us to burn," a voice hissed, low and guttural. I stumbled back, the axe clutched tightly in my hands. "Who are you? What do you want?" The shadow didn't answer. It surged forward, and for a moment I saw its face, hollow, charred, and filled with rage. I slammed the door shut, my heart hammering in my chest. The next morning, I found the RV's exterior scorched. The same claw marks burned into the metal. The air reeked of smoke, and my supplies were scattered across the ground as if something had ransacked them. I couldn't stay. I packed what I could and started hiking toward a cave I'd noticed earlier on one of my hikes. I didn't have a plan, only the desperate need to get away from whatever was haunting me. The cave was deeper than I'd expected, its walls etched with ancient carvings. They depicted a figure cloaked in flames, surrounded by people kneeling in fear. Beneath it were symbols I couldn't read, but their meaning was clear. This was no ordinary place. The air inside the cave was stifling, the heat almost unbearable. I turned to leave, but the shadow was waiting for me. It towered at the entrance, its fiery form flickering and shifting. "You cannot escape," it growled. The carvings flashed in my mind. This was the spirit of the valley, a force of fire and vengeance. I raised the axe, my hands trembling. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice cracking. "For whatever happened, for what I couldn't stop, but I won't let you take me." The spirit lunged, its heat searing my skin. I swung the axe with all my strength, striking the ground where a fumarole hissed. Steam erupted, flooding the cave with scalding water. The spirit screamed, its fiery form extinguished as the water surged through the space. When the cave fell silent, I staggered outside, burned and exhausted, but alive. I never went back to the valley. My RV was gone, consumed by fire, but I didn't care. I left Katmai behind, vowing to dedicate my life to protecting the land I once failed. But the shadow in the valley stayed with me, a reminder of what I'd faced and what I'd overcome. My name is Evelyn Price, and I'm 35 years old. Last summer, I packed my life into an RV and hit the road, looking for something I couldn't quite name. I told people it was for my blog, that I wanted to document the most beautiful and remote places in Alaska. But the truth, I was running. Running from a divorce, from a career I no longer cared about, from myself. This happened in Resurrection Bay, near Seward, Alaska. It was supposed to be just another stop on my journey. A week of solitude, kayaking, and photographing the rugged beauty of the bay. I didn't plan for what happened. No one could. I parked the RV in a small clearing near the water, far from the tourist spots. It was perfect, serene, isolated, with the mountains rising sharply around the bay like sentinels. The air smelled like salt and pine, and the only sounds were the gentle lapping of water and the occasional call of a bird. After setting up camp, I took my kayak out for a test paddle. The water was cold and glassy, the sky a soft gray that promised rain later. I felt lighter out there, the weight of my divorce, and the past few months lifting, even if just for a moment. But as I paddled back to shore, I noticed something strange. My kayak started to list to the side, the water beneath it churning unnaturally. I froze, my paddle hovering above the surface. Then, just as quickly, it stilled. I laughed it off, chalking it up to nerves or an overactive imagination. But deep down, it felt like the bay was watching me. That night, after a simple dinner of canned soup, I settled into the RV to edit photos. The sun dipped behind the mountains, casting the bay in shadow. The quiet was almost oppressive. As I flipped through my shots, something caught my eye. In one photo, a wide shot of the bay, I saw a pale figure in the water. It was small, blurry, barely more than a smudge, but it hadn't been there when I took the photo. My pulse quickened. A trick of the light, I told myself, a reflection or a piece of driftwood. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that crept in. I went to bed early, but sleep didn't come. The silence outside felt heavy, too complete. Then, faintly, I heard it. A low, melodic hum, like a song carried on the wind. I sat up, straining to hear. It wasn't a bird or the sound of water. It was human, or at least it sounded human. I peeked out the window, but the bay was empty, the water calm and dark. The song faded as quickly as it had started, leaving me with a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The next morning, I found my kayak floating 20 feet from shore, though I was certain I'd secured it the night before. Annoyed but determined not to let it ruin my trip, I waded into the freezing water to retrieve it. As I pulled it back, my foot brushed against something solid and smooth, like polished stone. I yanked my foot up and stumbled back to shore, my heart pounding. On the sand, I found a single leather shoe, old, cracked, and bloated from the water. Nearby, half buried in the gravel, was a locket. When I opened it, I found a photo of a woman, her expression blank and her eyes distant. The locket smelled faintly of salt and decay. That evening, the song returned. Louder this time, closer. It wasn't just humming now. There were words, though I couldn't understand them. The melody was haunting, beautiful in a way that made my chest ache. I opened the RV door and stepped outside, my breath visible in the cold night air. The bay shimmered under the moonlight, and there, near the water's edge, was a figure. She stood waist-deep in the bay, her pale skin glowing, her hair flowing like dark ribbons around her shoulders. She was singing. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. She turned to me, and for a moment I thought she smiled. Then she vanished beneath the surface. I told myself I was imagining things, but the signs were everywhere. Each day, I found more objects on the shore. A rusted compass, a soaked notebook filled with smeared, illegible writing. At night, the singing grew louder, more insistent, like it was calling me. On the third night, I woke to find myself standing knee-deep in the bay, my legs numb from the cold. I didn't remember walking there. The siren's voice was in my head now, whispering promises of peace, of belonging. My life, the divorce, the failure of my career, none of it would matter if I just let go. I ran back to the RV, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands shook as I locked it, though I knew deep down that a lock wouldn't stop whatever was out there. The next morning, I found a note tucked under my windshield wiper. The paper was damp, the ink smudged, but I could still read it. "Leave now, or you'll never leave at all." My stomach churned. Someone, or something, wanted me gone. Desperate for answers, I hiked to a nearby ranger station. The ranger, an older man with a weathered face, listened as I told him about the singing, the objects, the figure in the water. "You've been out there alone too long," he said, his tone dismissive. "The mind plays tricks. The bay's a strange place, but it's just water and rocks. Nothing to be afraid of." But his eyes betrayed him. He knew something, and he wasn't telling me. That night, I made a decision. I wouldn't run. I had to face whatever was out there. Armed with a flare gun and an old mirror from the RV, I dragged my kayak to the shore and paddled out into the bay. The water was eerily calm, the air thick with tension. The song began again, soft and alluring. "I know you're there," I called out, my voice shaking. "What do you want?" The water rippled, and she appeared. The siren. Her beauty was unearthly, her eyes glinting like polished stones. She swam closer, her voice weaving through my thoughts. "You're lost," she whispered. "I can take it all away. Just let go." Her voice was hypnotic, but as she neared, her illusion faltered. Her skin cracked, revealing patches of gray, scaly flesh. Her eyes turned black, bottomless voids. She lunged, her hands reaching for the edge of my kayak. I raised the mirror, angling it toward her. Her reflection was hideous. Jagged teeth, hollow eyes, her face a mask of decay. She recoiled with a shriek, the sound piercing and inhuman. As she thrashed, I grabbed the flare gun and fired it into the water beside her. The light illuminated the bay, casting her monstrous form in stark relief before she vanished beneath the waves. I paddled back to shore, my limbs trembling with exhaustion and fear. The bay was silent now, the air still. I didn't sleep that night. At first light, I packed up the RV and drove away, not daring to look back. Even now, I can't fully explain what happened, but I know this: the bay doesn't want you there. It's beautiful, yes, but it hides something ancient, something hungry. If you ever find yourself at Resurrection Bay and you hear singing, don't listen, don't follow it. Leave while you still can. My name is Jessica Martinez, and I was 29 when this happened. It was the summer of 2022, and I had planned a camping trip with my two best friends, Mike Reynolds and Renee Bishop, to Skilac Lake in Alaska. I had no idea that what started as an adventure to escape our busy lives would turn into the most horrifying experience of my life. We arrived at the Skilac Lake campground late in the afternoon, the sun still hanging high over the serene waters. Renee immediately unpacked her camera gear, eager to start snapping pictures of the surrounding wilderness, while Mike and I worked on setting up the RV. The RV was an old rental, held together more by duct tape and hope than actual maintenance. The generator sputtered a few times before kicking in, which worried Mike. He's the cautious one, always double-checking safety measures and pointing out potential risks. Sometimes it drove me crazy. "Jess, are you sure about this spot? It's remote as hell, and we don't even have cell service," Mike said, wiping sweat from his brow. "That's the point, Mike," I replied, rolling my eyes. "We're here to disconnect, relax, breathe, and enjoy the wild." Renee laughed as she adjusted her camera lens. "Besides, who needs cell service when you've got views like this? Come on, Mike, live a little?" By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, we'd settled in, our small campfire crackling. Renee was fiddling with her camera while Mike grilled some fish we'd bought earlier in the day. I leaned back in my camping chair, soaking in the quiet. But then we heard it, a distant, drawn-out cry. It sounded almost human but warped, like someone screaming underwater. We froze, glancing at each other. "Probably just a fox," I said, though my voice wavered. Mike wasn't convinced. "Foxes don't sound like that, Jess." "Maybe it's an owl," Renee suggested, though she didn't sound sure either. We brushed it off, but an uneasy silence settled over us. The cry came again later that night, fainter but still chilling. By then we'd locked ourselves inside the RV, the small space feeling strangely comforting. The next morning, Renee was the first to notice something odd. She pointed out a group of deer standing near the edge of the forest, their bodies unnaturally still. They all faced the same direction, staring into the woods like statues. "That's weird," she muttered, snapping a photo. It's just deer, I said, though I couldn't stop staring at them. There was something unnerving about their rigid postures. As we walked down to the lake, I noticed something else, a dead fish lying on the shore, its body untouched by scavengers. It looked almost placed. Mike inspected it with a frown. "This is starting to feel off," he said. "We should stick close to the RV today." Of course, I dismissed his concerns, chalking it up to his overactive imagination. We spent the day exploring the area, but that eerie feeling never fully left. That evening, as we sat around the fire, a man stumbled into our camp. He was gaunt and disheveled, his clothes torn and dirty. Renee gasped, and Mike jumped up ready to help. "Are you okay?" Mike asked, reaching out to steady him. The man flinched. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice a raspy whisper. "What do you mean?" I asked, my stomach tightening. "They're out there," he said, his eyes darting toward the woods. "Things that wear our faces. They're watching you." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Who's watching us?" He didn't answer. Instead, he muttered something under his breath and bolted into the trees before we could stop him. That night, everything changed. It started with a soft knock on the RV door around midnight. Renee sat up, rubbing her eyes. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded, my heart pounding. Mike grabbed a flashlight and peeked through the small window, but there was nothing outside. Then I heard it, my own voice calling from the darkness. "Jess, help me." I froze. It was unmistakably my voice, but warped, drawn out in a way that made my skin crawl. "Mike, did you hear that?" I whispered. "I heard it," he said, his voice tight. "That wasn't you." Renee's eyes were wide with terror. What the hell is going on? The knocking came again, louder this time. Mike swung the door open, shining the flashlight into the night, but there was no one there, only claw-like scratches on the RV's metal door. The next day, things escalated. Renee swore she saw me walking by the lake, but when she called out, the figure disappeared into the woods. She came back pale and shaken, insisting it wasn't me. Later, Mike stumbled upon an old fire pit surrounded by bones and strange symbols carved into the dirt. He showed them to me, and though I didn't recognize the symbols, they gave me a sense of deep unease. "This isn't random," he said. "Someone or something put this here." That evening, our RV generator failed. We were plunged into darkness, relying on flashlights and lanterns. I could feel the fear in the air, thick and suffocating. Then, Renee disappeared. We'd been sitting around the fire when she got up to retrieve her camera from the RV. When she didn't return, I went to check on her, only to find the RV empty. "Mike, she's gone!" I shouted, panic rising in my chest. We grabbed our flashlights and searched the area, calling her name. Finally, we found her near the edge of the woods, standing motionless and staring into the trees. "Renee!" I yelled, running to her. She turned to face me, her eyes glassy and unfocused. "I saw it," she whispered. "I saw myself." I felt a cold knot of dread in my stomach. "What do you mean?" It was me, but it wasn't me. It smiled at me, Jess. That night, the Skinwalker revealed itself. As we huddled in the RV, we heard distorted voices circling the camp. Our own voices, laughing, arguing, crying. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the RV. Mike peered out the window, his face going pale. "It's there," he whispered. I followed his gaze and saw it. A gaunt, humanoid figure standing just outside the beam of the flashlight. Its glowing eyes bore into me, and its twisted features shifted as if trying to mimic a human face. "Stay inside," Mike said. grabbing a makeshift torch from the fire pit. He stepped outside, brandishing the torch. The creature snarled and backed away, but it didn't leave. It lingered just beyond the firelight, watching us with predatory patience. We didn't sleep that night. As dawn broke, we decided to leave. The RV wouldn't start, so we grabbed our packs and made a run for the nearest ranger station, a few miles away. The trail felt endless, the dense forest pressing in on us. We heard whispers all around, distorted and mocking. At one point, I thought I saw Mike ahead of me, but when I caught up, he was behind me, his face pale. "We're being hunted," he said, his voice trembling. Finally, we reached the ranger station, only to find it abandoned. The door hung open, the interior in disarray. "We need to get out of here," Renee said, her voice shaking. In the garage, we found an old Jeep. Mike managed to hotwire it, and we sped down the dirt road, leaving the forest and the creature behind. Back in town, we tried to explain what had happened, but no one believed us. Locals gave us knowing looks, warning us to stay away from certain places. It wasn't until days later that Renee showed me a photo she'd found on her camera. A photo of the skinwalker, standing behind her as she snapped the shot. I'll never forget its eyes. My name is Maria Vasquez, and I was 34 when this happened. It was late September 2021, and I'd parked my RV at the trailhead of Crow Pass Trail in Chugach State Park, Alaska. I'd come here alone, like I always did on these trips, to escape and to clear my head. After a brutal breakup and the loss of my corporate job, I needed to prove to myself that I was still strong, still capable of something. I told myself that this was just another hike, another blog entry to document, another photo album to fill. But this trip was different. From the very start, something felt wrong. The first day was uneventful, or so I convinced myself. The weather was clear, the trail rugged but manageable. I took pictures of the mountains, draped in golden autumn light, and the first whispers of snow dusting the higher peaks. It wasn't until late afternoon that I noticed something odd. As I climbed a ridge, the wind carried voices. Not the cheerful calls of hikers or the chatter of birds, but faint, distorted murmurs. At first, I thought it was the wind echoing through the valley, but the longer I stood there, the more distinct the voices became. They were soft, almost familiar. I shook it off. Probably other hikers farther down the trail, I thought, but I hadn't seen anyone all day. I returned to my RV that evening, parking it at a secluded spot by the trailhead. As I cooked dinner, I tried to push the unease aside. The faint voices, the eerie stillness of the woods, these were just tricks of my imagination. Solitude could do that. Around midnight, I woke to a sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard it again. Footsteps crunching in the gravel outside, slow, deliberate. I sat bolt upright, heart pounding. Grabbing my flashlight, I peered out the small window. Nothing. The forest was bathed in silver moonlight, every shadow stretching long and jagged. "Just a deer," I muttered to myself, though my voice shook. I didn't sleep much after that. The next day, I set out to explore more of the trail. About 3 miles in, I stumbled upon an old cabin. It sat tucked beneath a canopy of trees, its roof sagging and walls weathered by decades of snow and rain. The door hung slightly ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. Curiosity got the better of me. I stepped inside. The air was colder here, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones. Scratched into the wooden walls were symbols I didn't recognize. Spirals, crosses, and jagged lines that looked almost like claw marks. A rusty pickaxe and a few rotting planks were all that remained of its contents. As I turned to leave, I heard a whisper, soft and fleeting, like someone murmuring just out of earshot. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. The whisper came again, clearer this time. "Maria." I froze. How did they know my name? By the time I made it back to my RV, the weather had turned. A dense fog rolled in, swallowing the landscape. I could barely see a few feet in front of me. That night, the dreams started. I was trudging through deep snow, my breath freezing in the air. Around me were shadowy figures, their faces pale and frostbitten. They moved slowly, their eyes hollow and filled with despair. "Help us," one of them whispered, reaching for me with skeletal hands. I woke, drenched in sweat, gasping for air. The third day was worse. I found a journal buried near the cabin, half hidden beneath a pile of rocks. The leather cover was cracked, and the pages were brittle, but I could make out some of the writing. It belonged to a miner named Elias, who had been part of a prospecting group in the late 1800s. They'd been caught in a brutal blizzard and trapped in the mountains for weeks. As I read, my stomach turned. The entries grew more frantic, detailing their dwindling supplies and the fights that broke out among the group. The final entry was scrawled in jagged handwriting. "We did what we had to. May God forgive us." I didn't want to think about what that meant. That night, the RV wasn't safe anymore. The fog thickened, pressing against the windows like a living thing. Around midnight, I heard scratching. It started faint, like a branch brushing the side of the RV, but it grew louder and more insistent. I shone my flashlight outside. Carved into the fogged-up glass of the window were the same strange symbols I'd seen in the cabin. My blood turned to ice. Then came the voices. They were all around me, whispering, echoing, repeating things I'd said to myself earlier on the trail. "I can do this. I'm fine. No one's here." Each phrase was twisted, mocking. I grabbed my journal and started writing, anything to distract myself. That's when I noticed something chilling. The symbols from the cabin were now scratched into the RV's walls. On the fourth day, I decided to leave. The RV wouldn't start. The battery, which had been fully charged, was completely dead. I grabbed my pack, loaded it with essentials, and started hiking toward the nearest ranger station about 5 miles away. The forest felt alive, watching me. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. Halfway there, I saw it. A figure stood in the fog just ahead on the trail. It waved, beckoning me forward. At first, I thought it was a ranger or another hiker, but as I got closer, something about it felt wrong. Its movements were too jerky, too unnatural. When I called out, it vanished. The ranger station was abandoned. The door hung open, the interior ransacked. Papers and supplies were scattered across the floor, and an old radio crackled faintly with static. On the desk was a faded photo of a group of miners. My heart sank when I recognized the face of Elias from the journal. I heard a creak behind me. Spinning around, I saw them, ghostly figures standing in the doorway, their frostbitten faces twisted in pain. "Why are you here?" one of them whispered, their voice raspy and hollow. I clutched the journal and the locket I'd found in the cabin, holding them up like a shield. "I'm sorry," I stammered. "I didn't mean to disturb you." The figures hesitated. One of them, the one I assumed was Elias, reached for the locket. "Her," he whispered, his fingers trembling. The fog around them began to lift, and for a moment their faces softened. Then, one by one, they faded into the mist, leaving only silence. I managed to find an old Jeep in the station's garage. It took hours of fiddling, but I finally got it started and sped down the mountain, never looking back. Back in Anchorage, I tried to tell my story, but no one believed me. They chalked it up to exhaustion or an overactive imagination. But I know what I saw, And sometimes, late at night when the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear their voices, echoes in the mist calling me back. My name is Rachel Monroe, and I'm 42 years old. For most of my life, I've been a wilderness guide and park ranger, someone who could read the land like a map and face the wild without fear. But I wasn't fearless, not really. I was running from a failure that still haunts me. This happened in Eklutna Flats, just outside Anchorage, Alaska. I don't talk about it much, but maybe writing it down will help me understand what happened, or at least warn others. I arrived at Eklutna Flats on a bright morning in July, my RV rumbling over the uneven dirt road. The area was quiet, untouched, the kind of place that reminded me why I chose this life. Thick spruce forest surrounded the clearing, and the air smelled of wet earth and pine. My plan was simple: camp here for a week, map out new hiking routes, and maybe find a way to forgive myself. 2 years ago, I lost a hiker, a young man, barely 20, who wandered off the trail during one of my guided tours. We searched for him for days, but by the time we found his body, it was too late. I hadn't been fast enough, smart enough. That failure drove me into isolation, and this trip was supposed to be a step toward healing. I parked the RV near the edge of the forest and set up camp. The first day was uneventful. I hiked a short loop, jotting down notes about the terrain and taking photos. The forest was dense but beautiful, with moss-covered boulders and streams winding through the trees. When I returned to the RV that evening, I felt good, productive. Maybe this was exactly what I needed. The first sign that something was wrong came the next morning. I'd planned a longer hike, aiming to reach a ridge overlooking the lake. But as I followed the trail, my compass started spinning wildly. I tapped it, shook it, but it wouldn't settle. Annoyed, I turned to my GPS only to find the screen blank. I had extra batteries, but even with a fresh set, the device wouldn't turn on. I wasn't worried. I'd spent years navigating without gadgets. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest seemed darker than it should have been, the air heavier. And then I noticed the cairns. Small stacks of stones dotted the trail, each one carefully balanced. At first, I thought they were markers left by other hikers, but as I moved deeper into the woods, they became more frequent and more intricate. Some were shaped like arches, others like tiny pyramids. I crouched to examine one, noticing carvings on the stones. Spirals, stick figures, symbols I didn't recognize. That night, I woke to a sound I couldn't place. At first, I thought it was wind in the trees, but as I listened, I realized it was rhythmic, almost musical. Drumming, low and steady, like a heartbeat. I sat up, peering out the RV's window. The clearing was empty, bathed in pale moonlight, but the drumming didn't stop. It seemed to come from the forest, pulling at me like a tide. I stayed inside, telling myself it was nothing, maybe a trick of the wind or an animal. But when I stepped out the next morning, my stomach dropped. The cairns were everywhere now, surrounding my RV in a wide circle. In the center of the circle lay my old ranger badge. It was tarnished, the leather backing cracked, but it was unmistakably mine. I hadn't seen it in months. I spent the day trying to distract myself, but the forest seemed to close in around me. The drumming returned in the afternoon, louder now, and I swore I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, shadowy figures slipping between the trees. By evening, my nerves were shot. I decided to hike out to the ridge, thinking the open view would clear my head. The trail twisted through the trees, and the cairns followed me, more elaborate with every step. I found another object nestled between the stones. My boots, the ones I wore the day we searched for the lost hiker. They were muddy and damp, as if I'd just taken them off. "Enough," I muttered. My voice sounded small in the vast silence. When I finally reached the ridge, the view took my breath away. The lake stretched out below, its surface shimmering in the fading light. But my relief was short-lived. Across the water, I saw them. Figures standing in the shallows, their outlines blurred but unmistakably human. They didn't move, didn't wave or shout. They just stood there, watching. By the time I returned to the RV, it was nearly dark. The drumming was louder than ever, echoing through the clearing. My heart raced as I locked the door and pulled the curtain shut. I told myself I was safe inside, but deep down, I knew the forest didn't care about doors or locks. I don't know when I fell asleep, but I woke to the sound of footsteps. They were soft, deliberate, circling the RV. I grabbed my flashlight and hesitated, my hand hovering over the door handle. Finally, I flung the door open, shining the beam into the clearing. Nothing. No footprints, no movement, just the oppressive silence of the forest. But when I turned back toward the RV, I froze. Written in the condensation on the window were 2 words: "Save them." The next morning, I found the journal. It was tucked into the base of one of the cairns, its pages brittle and yellowed. The writing was frantic, full of warnings about the spirits of the forest. The author described how they'd tried to trap his group, using their fears and regrets to wear them down. "Do not trust what you see," one entry read. "They will twist your mind until you're one of them." The final pages were smeared with dirt and water, but one sentence stood out: "Destroy the cairn, or you will never leave." I knew what I had to do, but I was terrified. That night, I built a small fire outside the RV, gathering herbs and stones to create a makeshift ward. Then, I followed the cairns into the forest, their trail winding deeper and deeper until I reached a clearing. In the center stood a massive cairn, taller than me, its stones carved with the same spirals and symbols I'd seen before. The drumming was deafening now, and the air vibrated with energy. The shadowy figures surrounded the clearing, their forms flickering like smoke. I could feel their anger, their sorrow, their hunger. "I'm sorry," I whispered, though I didn't know who I was apologizing to. "But I can't stay." I smashed the cairn with a heavy branch, the stones scattering across the ground. The figures shrieked, their forms dissolving into the air. The drumming stopped, leaving only silence. When I stumbled back to the RV, the forest felt different, lighter, less oppressive. I packed up at dawn and left Eklutna Flats without looking back. I don't know if I freed the spirits or simply escaped their grasp, but one thing is certain: that land remembers. It holds on to its pain, its history, and it doesn't let go easily. If you ever find yourself near Eklutna Flats, tread carefully, and if you hear drumming, don't follow it, just leave. Trust me on this. My name is Naomi Graves, and I'm 41 years old. This happened in late October, during what was supposed to be a peaceful solo trip to Tongass National Forest in Alaska. I'm a wildlife ecologist and amateur filmmaker, and I had planned this trip to document the elusive Alexander Archipelago wolf. It was going to be my crowning achievement, a rare look into a species most people barely know exists. Instead, I walked into something I can't explain, something that still keeps me awake at night. I arrived at the forest on a crisp gray morning, driving my rented RV down a winding dirt road. The trees stretched endlessly in every direction, cloaked in a perpetual fog that clung to the forest floor like a living thing. The silence was the first thing I noticed. No birds, no rustling leaves, just a profound stillness that made me feel like I was intruding. The site I picked was perfect, or so I thought. a secluded clearing on the edge of the old-growth forest. I parked the RV, set up my gear, and took a few deep breaths to settle my nerves. Being alone in the wilderness was nothing new to me, but something about this place felt heavy, like the trees were watching. The first day was uneventful. I scouted the area, set up camera traps along a promising wolf trail, and returned to the RV as the sun dipped below the horizon. By nightfall, the temperature had plummeted, and the fog had thickened, reducing visibility to a few feet. I fell asleep to the hum of the RV heater, feeling the kind of tired that only comes after a long day in the field. Sometime after midnight, I woke up. It wasn't a sound that roused me, more of a sensation, like the air in the RV had shifted. I sat up, blinking into the darkness, and listened. At first, all I heard was my own breathing, but then came a faint whisper. It wasn't inside the RV, but just outside, too low to make out the words. I froze. I'd camped in remote areas before, but this was different. The whispering didn't feel like it came from a person or animal. It felt wrong. Probably the wind, I muttered, forcing myself to lie back down. But sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, I found strange markings on the ground near my RV. At first, I thought they were natural, maybe claw marks from a bear or some other animal. But as I looked closer, I realized they were deliberate. Spirals and lines carved into the dirt with precision. I photographed them, telling myself they were likely left by other hikers or hunters. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I buried myself in work, checking the camera traps and hiking deeper into the forest. Around midday, I stumbled across another set of markings, this time carved into the bark of a tree. The spirals were more intricate, almost mesmerizing. That evening, as I reviewed the footage from my traps, I realized none of them had recorded anything, even though I'd seen fresh wolf tracks nearby. Frustrated, I tried to troubleshoot, but everything seemed in working order. It didn't make sense. By the second night, the whispering returned, louder this time. I stayed in bed, clutching the flashlight I'd left within arm's reach. Then came the footsteps, soft but deliberate, circling the RV. My heart pounded as I peeked through the curtains, but the fog outside was too thick to see anything. The next morning, I found my camera bag hanging from a high branch I couldn't have reached without a ladder. My boots, which I'd left near the door, were soaked as if they'd been submerged in water. There was no logical explanation for any of it. I decided to hike further into the forest, hoping to find answers, or maybe just distract myself. That's when I found the stone circle. It was a clearing surrounded by towering pines, the ground covered in moss and dead leaves. In the center stood a ring of ancient stones, blackened by fire. Inside the ring were bones, too large to belong to any animal I recognized. My breath caught in my throat as I noticed the symbols carved into the stones, identical to the ones I'd seen near my RV. When I returned to the RV, I found a man waiting for me, leaning against the hood with a solemn expression. He introduced himself as Thomas Aklak, a local guide. He claimed he'd seen my RV parked on his way to town and decided to check in. "Do you know about this place?" I asked, showing him the photos of the symbols. Thomas's face darkened. "You need to leave," he said bluntly. "This forest, it's cursed." He told me about Eleanor Drayton, a fur trader's wife accused of witchcraft in the 19th century. When her husband disappeared under mysterious circumstances, the locals turned on her, banishing her into the forest. Before she vanished, she cursed the land, vowing to mark and claim anyone who trespassed. "It's just a story," I said, trying to sound skeptical. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. Thomas handed me a small pouch of salt. "Scatter this around your camp. It won't break the curse, but it might buy you time. The third night was the worst. The fog was so thick I couldn't see the edge of the clearing, and the whispering was constant, like a chorus of voices surrounding me. I stayed inside the RV, salt scattered around the perimeter, and tried to convince myself I was safe. Then the knocking started. 3 sharp raps on the door, followed by silence. I held my breath, my hand trembling as I gripped the flashlight. The knocking came again, louder this time. When I finally worked up the courage to peek through the window, I saw nothing but fog. Suddenly, the RV shook, as if something had slammed into it. The lights flickered, and a cold draft swept through the interior. My camera fell from the counter, and when I picked it up, the screen was filled with static. I hit play on the last recording and my blood ran cold. There, in the background of the footage, was a figure. Pale, gaunt, and draped in tattered clothing, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through the screen. Eleanor. Desperate, I grabbed the salt pouch and headed for the stone circle. My every step felt heavy, the air pressing against me as if the forest itself was trying to stop me. When I reached the clearing, the stones seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, the symbols glowing faintly in the darkness. I poured the salt around the stones and threw a match into the fire pit. The flames roared to life, illuminating the figure that stood on the edge of the circle. It was Eleanor, just as I'd seen her in the footage. Her voice filled the air, a chilling blend of anger and sorrow. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered. I clutched the silver wolf head pendant my grandmother had given me years ago, holding it out like a talisman. Eleanor recoiled, her form flickering like a shadow. I took the chance to destroy the central symbol, kicking over one of the stones and scattering the ashes. The whispers stopped, the fog lifted, and Eleanor was gone. I stumbled back to the RV at dawn, my body aching and my mind reeling. The forest was eerily quiet again, but this time it felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. When I reached the nearest ranger station, Thomas was waiting for me. I told him everything, and he nodded gravely. "She won't bother you any more," he said. "But others might not be so lucky." I left Alaska the next day, swearing never to return. The footage I salvaged showed glimpses of Eleanor's ghost, but no one would believe me if I tried to share it. Instead, I filed my documentary without mentioning the curse, choosing to keep the truth to myself. Some nights, though, I still dream of the stone circle and the whispers in the fog, and I wonder how many others have been marked before me.